माननीय सदस्यगण, जिन्हें आज नियम 377 के अधीन मामले उठाने की अनुमति दी गई है, वे व्यक्तिगत रूप से तत्काल मामले का अनुमोदित पाठ सभा पटल पर प्रस्तुत करें। आइटम नंबर 19, केंद्रीय बजट पर सामान्य चर्चा। डॉक्टर शशि तरूर जी।
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. May I have your permission to speak seated? I am afraid I have a fracture on my foot.
You are permitted, sir.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for granting me the honor of voicing on behalf of the Indian National Congress my perspective on the Union budget presented by the Honourable Finance Minister, whom I'm glad to see in the chamber. Last year, when I was standing in this very place, I had remarked that the 2025 Finance Bill reminded me of the garage mechanic who said, "I couldn't fix your brakes, so I made the horn louder." Looking at the budget this year, I'm saddened to observe that though the horn has been muted, that there hasn't been enough movement. For this budget too appears to be a squandered opportunity, equivalent to rearranging the airbags on a crashing car while assuring the passengers that the chassis is sturdy and they will feel better afterwards. This budget is praised for prudence, but prudence without vision or fairness is hollow. It ignores unemployment, it ignores rising living costs, and it ignores inequality, offering little to address the real struggles and aspirations of the Aam Aadmi. The government speaks endlessly of welfare, but its spending tells a very different story. Behind flashy announcements like chronic underutilization and administrative failure. Media reports show that of over 5 lakh crore budgeted for 53 major welfare and infrastructure schemes last year, barely 41% was spent in the first 9 months of the fiscal year. Take the Jal Jeevan Mission, allotted 67,000 crores, it managed to spend an astonishingly low 31 crores in 9 months. The much-touted PM Schools for Rising India scheme spent only 473 crores out of 7,500. Most shocking of all, the Pradhan Mantri Anusuchit Jati Abhyudaya Yojana, meant for the socio-economic upliftment of scheduled castes, utilized out of 2,140 crores, merely 40 crores. This is not governance, Mr. Chairman. This is headline management. Where promises are loud, like that horn, budgets are grand, but delivery is conspicuously absent. The budget this year has landed with a thud, not because of what it contains, but because of what it omits. Behind claims of fiscal prudence lie a more uncomfortable reality. The Indian state is shrinking, not by design, but by compulsion. Government expenditure as a share of GDP has declined over the past decade, briefly rising during the pandemic before reverting close to the 2016 levels, driven by stagnant revenue mobilization. Tax receipts have remained flat relative to GDP. Disinvestment has underperformed, and non-tax revenues increasingly rely on extraordinary transfers such as Reserve Bank of India dividends, an unsustainable substitute for a stable revenue base. More troubling is the shift in the tax burden towards individuals, bearing a greater share of the tax burden than corporations, despite sharp post-pandemic profit growth. To elaborate further, in fiscal year 2017, corporate taxes were 3.2% of GDP, personal income tax was 2.3% of GDP. In fiscal year 27, that is 10 years later, they are projected to be 3.1% for corporates and 3.7% for personal income tax of individuals. So your revenue is coming disproportionately from the individual taxpayers. Fiscal consolidation since COVID has been achieved largely through expenditure compression, presenting necessity as virtue and compulsion as choice. Within these constraints, the government has relied on low-cost measures such as tax simplification and targeted incentives, but the budget offers no credible medium-term framework linking spending to employment and productivity. Capital expenditure is emphasized, yet weak demand, stagnant wages, high youth unemployment, compressed welfare spending, and inadequate devolution to states all persist, leaving India fiscally disciplined but developmentally constrained, without the revenue capacity or strategic clarity to deliver real economic security for the Aam Aadmi. This is why, Mr. Chairman, this is what I call an underwhelming budget. Now, let me look at specific sectors. M.S. Swaminathan had famously said, if agriculture goes wrong, nothing else will have a chance to go right. And this, I believe, is as good a starting point as any. Mr. Chairman, it's high time we stop treating agriculture as some issue that will sort itself out, because 46.1% of India's workforce and 60% of our population depend on agriculture and allied activities. Despite agriculture contributing 16 to 17% of GDP, it receives only 3% of this union budget, 1.62 lakh crore, which is a 5.1% cut from last year's 1.71 lakh crore. Now, this underinvestment is all the more alarming, Mr. Chairman, given the existential threats facing Indian agriculture today. This sector, vital as it is increasingly threatened by climate change and misaligned farming practices. Nearly two-thirds of the country are prone to drought, and the toll of weather-related disasters has been severe. Yet the Fasal Bima Yojana, meant to protect farmers, has failed. Flawed assessments and opaque settlements have reduced compensation to token amounts, 1 rupee, 3 rupees, 21 rupees, as your minister himself has acknowledged, turning protection into systemic injustice. Matters are worsened by cuts that leave the scheme at its lowest budget allocation in 8 years, fueling fears that new initiatives will repeat a familiar cycle of announcement without commitment, as seen last year when Gradley announced missions on cotton technology, pulses, vegetables, fruits, and hybrid seeds, all quietly faded with zero funding in the revised estimates. These announcements are like modern courtships, promises without commitment. That's what this government does to us. At a time when farm distress is deepening, the budget silence on revising the PM Kisan Nidhi disbursement speaks louder than any promise made elsewhere. हमारे किसानों की आय दोगुनी करने का वादा तो आपसे पूरा हो नहीं पाया। कम से कम उनकी सम्मान निधि ही बढ़ा दीजिए। पिछले 6 सालों से ये सिर्फ 6,000 रुपए पर ही अटकी हुई है। While there is an imperative need for breakthroughs in research and development and AI-driven agricultural technologies, paradoxically, funding allocations for agricultural research and education have dipped by 4.8% from the previous year's 10,466 crore, that's now to 9,967 crore, decreasing precisely when the finance minister is announcing new AI schemes. And frankly, Madam, touting a new AI app when the majority of our farmers can't afford fertilizers, harvesters, or tractors seems rather detached from reality, except of the virtual kind. Now, this budget speaks at length about crops from cashews to coconuts, yet ignores one of agriculture's most persistent concerns, pepper. Once hailed as black gold, the sector is now in distress in my state. In Kerala, which is one of the country's leading producers of pepper, output has fallen from 40,000 plus tons to 30,000 tons and is projected to decline by a further 28.7% in the foreseeable future. The uncomfortable truth, Mr. Chairman, is that our spice market faces such deep challenges today that if history repeated itself, the British might not even bother looting us for it. Next to unemployment. This House has had this conversation far too many times. We recite the same statistics, express the same concerns, and then move on, while unemployment quietly worsens. The data at the end of 2025 makes one thing unmistakably clear. Rural unemployment has stagnated at 3.9%, while urban unemployment continues to rise, ending at 6.7% in December. The crisis is now starting to concentrate where aspirations and frustrations are colliding in our cities. And yet even the centre's flagship responses have failed to rise to the moment. Under the Pradhan Mantri Kaushal Vikas Yojana, barely 41% of certified candidates secured placements. More than half of those jobs were concentrated in just 5 sectors. And of the 1,380 crores released, 278 crores remained unutilized. The Prime Minister Internship Scheme tells a similar story. Allocation, 10,831 crores. Ministry spends 526 crores in the first 9 months. This pattern is recurrent, sir. In fiscal year 25, allocations were cut after large unspent balances, with actual spending at just 680 crores. So much for creating employment when we can't even spend the money allocated for the job of creating employment. And what of gig workers, the backbone of our new economy? There is no mention of them in the budget. Their welfare has been deprioritized at a time when unrest grows over the absence of clearly defined benefits, time-bound claims and appeals mechanisms, and mandatory disclosure of work hours, earnings and deductions. This silence further weakens the gig workers' access to social security in practice. Any discourse about the workers of our country stands incomplete without a discussion about Manrega, now replaced by the ambitious VB Ramji Act. It increased guaranteed work days from 100 to 125, introduced weekly wage payments, but at the same time it hollowed out the legal employment guarantee. While Manrega was demand-driven, fully centrally funded for unskilled wages, and rooted in decentralized planning, the new Act caps central funding through state-wise normative allocations, shifts 40% of the wage costs to most states, and allows the scheme to be paused for up to 60 days during the peak agricultural seasons, shrinking the real window of guaranteed work. Once a state's allocation is exhausted, workers' statutory right to employment effectively ends. This converts an open-ended rights-based program into a budget-restricted, centrally rationed scheme where fiscal ceilings override legal entitlements. The VB Ramji scheme received a massive allocation of 95,000 crores in this budget, yet it has a major overlooked flaw that also needs to be addressed as soon as possible, Madam Minister. It attempts inclusion, but perhaps unintentionally drives technological exclusion. Manrega trusted the panchayats and gram sabhas to plan work based on local needs and community strengths. But the Ramji Act mandates dashboards with GIS tools, PM Gati Shakti layers, central digital stacks. Local priorities are filtered through a Viksit Bharat National Rural Infrastructure Stack, making biometrics, geotagging, dashboards, and AI audits statutory requirements. Thus, for millions of tech workers, rural workers, one tech failure will mean exclusion without appeal and work without skill considerations. Now, when you have millions struggling to find work, Mr. Chairman, the least the government can do is to ensure that they move freely across the country to seek opportunities. But here too, Mr. Chairman, we see a pattern of neglect that is as consistent as it is shameful. Nowhere, I might add, is this neglect of connectivity clearer than in Kerala. Despite repeated demands for new railway lines to decongest existing routes, the state finds no mention in the Finance Minister's much-touted 7 high-speed railway corridor initiative. One is compelled to ask, does strategic connectivity end where political inconvenience begins? The consequences of this neglect are borne daily by passengers and railway staff alike in my state. Chronic overcrowding has pushed passenger capacity to dangerous limits. Sanitation has visibly deteriorated. Even basic facilities remain inadequate. It's telling, Mr. Chairman, that locomotive pilots entrusted with the safety of thousands are forced to work without assured access to toilets. For passengers, the experience is no better. Overcrowded coaches, unsanitary conditions, and a steady erosion of dignity that no glossy brochure can conceal. These failures are structural, they're not incidental. The railway sanction strength across categories stands at over 2 lakhs, yet only about 1.59 lakh employees are in service. This staffing deficit compromises safety, delays operations, and stretches frontline workers beyond reasonable limits. A railway system cannot run on announcements alone. Continued underinvestment in capacity, personnel, and basic human conditions risk turning the nation's lifeline into a symbol of administrative exhaustion. And it's not just railways, Mr. Chairman. We hear of national corridors and maritime ambitions, but Vilnius Port, India's gateway to global trade, our only port that can host the world's largest container ships, is treated as a local afterthought, with no central support announced for the road and rail connectivity that is hampering its potential as a world-class transshipment port. Similarly, while 20 new national waterways are to be operationalized, it remains unclear how many, if any, will benefit Kerala. Ship repair ecosystems are promised in Patna and Varanasi, but not in a state with 44 rivers and a rich inland waterway network. Our coastal communities, Mr. Chairman, face the deadly peril of sea erosion that has already leached so much of our territory into the sea. But there is no money for the sea walls and groins so essential for coastal protection. I have been raising this repeatedly in the House over the last 15 years. The centre tells me it's the state's problem. The state says it has no money. So we continue losing our territory, our seafront, to the marauding ocean. The lives and livelihoods of our fisherfolk, mostly living below the poverty line, are apparently of no concern to our budget makers either. And if maritime connectivity disappoints, Mr. Chairman, should we rely on the air? The regional connectivity scheme, which promised to give wings to the armed Nagrik to lift aspirations off the ground, make the skies accessible to all, yet today, many of those promises lie grounded. Nearly a decade on, at least 11 airports launched under UDAN have seen flights taper off or disappear altogether. Runways without aircraft, terminals without passengers, skies conspicuously empty. Last year, we were promised a modified UDAN with 120 new destinations and 4 crore passengers. But in this budget, Mr. Chairman, UDAN does not even earn a mention. Not just that, but for fiscal year 24-25, a total of 81 airports owned and operated by the Airports Authority have incurred financial losses. Duopolies have led to declining service quality, with the Indigo fiasco exposing the vulnerabilities of our airline industry. When aviation policies cannot stay airborne beyond announcements, one must ask whether this government is still committed to democratizing the skies, as it claims, or rather, as the minister claimed last year. Mr. Chairman, if connectivity cannot move people physically, one would hope education might lift them socially and economically. But here too, we see a betrayal of promises. India speaks of global excellence while presiding over domestic neglect. The national education policy promised 6% of GDP for education. Years later, spending remains at barely 4%, with the union government contributing only 0.4% and leaving states to shoulder an unsustainable burden. The consequences are visible and damaging. Over 1.5 lakh schools lack electricity, thousands lack toilets, ramps, or basic facilities for children with disabilities, and the foundations of learning continue to crumble even as we advertise world-class universities. This neglect hits the most vulnerable the hardest. For scheduled castes, enrollment falls from 99% at the preparatory stage to 70% at the secondary level. For scheduled tribes, from 99% to just 67%. These numbers reveal a system where poverty pushes students out of classrooms and into premature work. We are told artificial intelligence will shape our future, yet only 52% of government schools have functional computers, just 58% have internet access. Where is artificial intelligence going to come to these schools? Technology without access is not transformation, Madam Minister. It is exclusion by design. Continued underfunding paired with grand promises will not uplift our children. It will mortgage India's future at a discount. Mr. Chairman, if education is one pillar of development the government should care about, health is surely the other. Budgets may speak in numbers, but nations are built in flesh and blood. And any budget serious about India's economic potential must invest in human capital, because healthcare is not charity, it is foresight. Yet public health spending remains below 2% of GDP, missing even the government's own promise of 2.5% after COVID. An allocation of over 1 lakh crore to the health ministry may sound impressive,
but ambition must be measured in proportion, not in numbers. The consequences are now visible beyond government hospitals. Since 2019, over 600 private hospitals have exited the Ayushman Bharat Jan Arogya Yojana, revealing the fragility of coverage without delivery. Insurance that arrives late is merely distress deferred. Meanwhile, the fundamental determinants of health, clean air, safe water, nutritious food, and mental well-being continue to deteriorate even as disputes rise and mental health indicators worsen. A nation that seeks economic greatness cannot afford to economize on the health of its people. While you propose, Madam, exempting 7 additional rare disease drugs from import duties, your centers of excellence for rare diseases are few, unevenly distributed, and unable to utilize even the insufficient funds allocated, leaving thousands of patients to die every year for lack of treatment.
And nowhere is this pattern of neglect more glaring than in the case of the long-promised aims in Kerala. First year of the NDA government, the promise was announced. The promise still remains unrealized. A state with one of the strongest public health records in the country continues to wait, while this budget, like its predecessors, offers neither clarity, nor timelines, nor urgency. 22 aims have been sanctioned across India, Mr. Chairman, but when it comes to Kerala, the silence is deafening. And aims that is not even a dot on a map is not institution building, it is institutional disregard. Kerala does not lack need, capacity, or credibility. What it lacks, it seems, is visibility in this government's priorities. Why, Mr. Chairman, is Kerala invisible to this government? I'd like to know. Equally telling is the silence on air pollution. After months of public outrage and choking headlines, the finance minister's speech found space for everything except the air we breathe.
The National Clean Air Programme still runs on 2009 standards, weaker than the WHO's PM 2.5 norms, even as pollution control funding has been cut from 1,300 crores to 1,091 crores this year. A budget that saves on rupees but ignores the air its citizens breathe reduces development to bad arithmetic, not good progress. Mr. Chairman, the announcement of 3 new National Institutes of Pharmaceutical Education and Research, or NIPA, raises a troubling question of balance and intent once again. I'm sorry to return to my state, but Kerala, despite one of the country's strongest public health ecosystems and a proven record in healthcare delivery, once again went unaddressed, even as NIPAs are concentrated and clustered in northern and eastern India, and a single institute in Hyderabad is expected to serve the entire south. This imbalance is not new. I flagged it 2 years ago when I was chairman of the Standing Committee on Chemicals and Fertilizers. At a time when over 60% of India's 8,500 MSME drug units lack support to adopt even good manufacturing practices, such skewed institutional allocation risks shrinking rather than strengthening our manufacturing base. It also does little to reduce our dependence on China for nearly 2/3 of key active pharmaceutical ingredients, or to correct India's anemic R&D investment of just 0.64% of GDP, with even large pharma firms spending under 1% of net sales on their research. The result is predictable: limited innovation, continued reliance on low-cost biosimilars, and life-saving biologics priced far beyond the reach of most Indians, where public health spending remains so much below the GDP target of 2.5%. Without correcting regional imbalance and backing institutions with serious R&D support, this NIPA initiative risks sounding visionary while delivering exclusion. Now, all of these shortcomings in the sectors I've surveyed, in infrastructure, education, healthcare, might have been bearable if at least the economic burden were distributed equitably. But as per the UNDP Inequality-Adjusted Human Development Index, India ranks the lowest of all BRICS countries at 130. The silent shock absorbers of this economy are the middle class. They are now cracking under the strain. The symbols of success we see today, smartphones, cars, lifestyle assets, are only sustained by EMIs, Mr. Chairman, for the middle class, leaving the Aam Aadmi little room for health insurance, for savings or medical emergencies.
Credit cards are once a luxury or a convenience. They've now become a lifeline. Defaults rose 28% last year to 6,742 crore rupees, not because Indian households are reckless, but because they're running out of room to breathe. With 2.9 lakh crore rupees in outstanding dues and 10.5 crore cards in circulation, borrowing has become the price of staying afloat. Even as households struggle, the tax burden has quietly shifted onto them. Personal income tax now contributes over half of all direct taxes, while the corporate share declines, as I mentioned earlier. And while last year's budget at least acknowledged middle-class housing stress through the Swami Fund, this budget offers only silence. Inflation may look subdued on paper, but for citizens, the cost of living has merely been shifted. When the state fails to provide clean air, safe water, and uncontaminated food, households are forced to buy privately what should be public goods: air purifiers, water filters, basic safeguards. This burden is unequal, Mr. Chairman. The privileged can protect themselves, while the poor remain exposed. A nation cannot grow by exhausting the very people who sustain it. The Aam Aadmi who are financing this government are being sent deeply troubling signals on taxation. A one-time concession allowing special economic zone manufacturing units to sell domestically at reduced duties is little more than tokenism when the SEZ ecosystem itself is collapsing, with hundreds of zones shut and employment in free fall. More disturbing still is the withdrawal of income tax exemption on disability pensions for defense personnel. This move weakens social protection for disabled veterans who risk their lives for our country and draws an indefensible line between service-related disabilities and abdication of the state's moral duty to those who have made such sacrifices for the nation. Now, I'd like to acknowledge that amid this disaster and disorder, there has been some measure of fiscal discipline. The fiscal deficit has edged down from 4.5% to 4.4%. Minister speaks of a further reduction to 4.3%, and that sounds reassuring on paper. But I've been in this House long enough, Mr. Chairman, to remember when her predecessor, the late Arun Jaitley, as Finance Minister, set a target of 3.5%. We're nowhere near that benchmark today, yet we seem eager to applaud for settling at a much higher number. Perspective matters, sir, and without it, these figures lose their meaning, especially when they fail the only test that truly counts: whether the Aam Aadmi has more money in his pocket, whether he has wages that keep pace with prices, whether he or she has a life that is becoming easier. Fiscal prudence cannot be celebrated in isolation when household budgets remain under strain and economic security is elusive for millions. In this budget, the Union government has once again doubled down on an infrastructure-led growth strategy, raising capital expenditure to 12.2 lakh crores on the assumption that public capex will crowd in private investment and generate jobs. But this promise has yet to materialize. In fact, it hasn't materialized at all during this government's tenure. Private investment has throughout remained sluggish. Labor-intensive sectors are crowded out by capital-heavy projects. Welfare spending has been compressed, and key subsidies and social sector allocations fall short of stated goals. The burden has increasingly been pushed onto the states without adequate devolution of tax revenue. Meanwhile, unemployment, particularly amongst educated youth, remains distressingly high, and capacity utilization continues to remain below levels that would trigger a genuine private investment cycle. In this context, the capex-centric approach appears less like a strategy for inclusive growth and more like a gamble that ignores weak demand, joblessness, and the lived economic distress of the ordinary citizen. Mr. Chairman, no nation can develop on slogans or headlines alone. India's investment in research and development remains stuck at 0.6% of GDP, not only below advanced economies, but even below several emerging ones. China invests about 2.4%, Brazil even over 1%, the US 3.5%, South Korea 5% of GDP. A country that aspires to be a manufacturing and knowledge powerhouse cannot afford to treat research and development as an afterthought. I would urge the Minister to elevate R&D as a national priority. Now, on urban cities, on our cities, it should be pointed out that the hesitancy in innovation is reflected in the Smart Cities mission, which has become a reminder of unfulfilled promises. A decade after Smart Cities was announced, deadlines have been repeatedly extended from June 23 to December 25, no real change on the ground. Claims of 96% completion certainly ring hollow for somebody from Thiruvananthapuram or Warangal or Silvassa or Port Blair, because they're all incomplete. Large parts of the northeast continue to lag, leaving even the Parliamentary Standing Committee unconvinced. Instead of transforming urban life, the mission has largely polished a few elite enclaves, while basic services for millions remain untouched. I can't not mention the new interim trade agreement with the United States, sir, because that has just come out after the minister's speech. It looks less like a free trade agreement than a pre-committed purchase agreement that overturns every principle of reciprocity. How can we speak of a reciprocal tariff of 18% on one side and 0% on the other? At a time when India's total bilateral trade with the US stands at roughly $130 billion, and we have a trade surplus of only $45 billion, we have surprisingly promised to buy $500 billion worth of American goods over 5 years. This effectively converts a surplus into a long-term deficit by executive assurance rather than by market demand. No major economy has ever neutralized its own trade leverage in this manner. While the US continues to impose import tariffs of up to 18%, we have committed ourselves, apparently according to this joint statement that I've been seeing here, joint US-India statement, to impose tariffs up to 18% on Indian exports, and we to slash tariffs to near zero levels, open agriculture, dilute data localization, soften intellectual property safeguards, and even redirect strategic energy imports, especially away from Russia, to meet purchase targets. Now, this is not strategic balancing, it is economic preemption. Parliament has neither been told how farmers, MSMEs, and domestic industry will be protected, nor why India has voluntarily surrendered its negotiating power without securing proportional market access. Without securing proportional market access or policy space in return. I know the government will say, wait for the final agreement, it's coming in mid-March, but let them be aware these concerns exist right now, sir. Yeah. And the government's claim that India has secured a better deal than China, Vietnam, or other Asian economies does not withstand scrutiny. While India has obtained a tariff reduction of 1 or 2 percentage points from them, no East Asian economy has agreed to deliberately dilute its trade surplus with the US through guaranteed purchase commitments. On the contrary, China, Vietnam, and several ASEAN countries have actually expanded their trade surpluses with the US, even amid heightened trade tensions. And this ambiguity, Mr. Chairman, has a direct bearing on the credibility of the budget itself. When both the Minister of Commerce and Industry and the Minister of External Affairs were questioned on these commitments, they were really offered no clear explanation of their scale, timeline, or fiscal implications. Now, the reason I mention this in the context of the budget is that key budgetary assumptions on trade balances, external financing needs, and overall macroeconomic stability rest on information that the Parliament does not possess and has not been given. A budget framed amid such uncertainty is not just incomplete, it asks this House to approve numbers without knowing the obligations that may soon overtake them from this trade agreement. Now, I do want to say that when the two ministers play ping-pong with each other, saying it's not in their mandate to answer the question, each one attributes it to the other, then that looks like a rather disappointing game, because when no minister claims ownership of something like this, accountability disappears, and Parliament is left staring at a budget that conceals obligations that the government seems to lack the courage to admit openly. In short, Mr. Chairman, the real weakness of this government's budget lies in its implementation, where rhetoric is not matched by reality. Let me quote that famous verse once again by Mirza Ghalib, which I think perfectly captures our reality today as reflected in this budget and its aspirations. हमको मालूम है जन्नत की हकीकत, हमें मालूम है जन्नत की हकीकत, लेकिन दिल बहलाने के लिए गालिब ये ख्याल अच्छा है. That seems to be what we have had inflicted upon us. We know the reality behind these claims, these tall promises, these narratives of model governance, but they're not policies grounded in outcomes. They're carefully curated illusions. Glossy schemes, utopian projections, they might soothe the imagination, dil to behlata hai. But everyday life for the ordinary citizen of India has remained unchanged. Hope is repeatedly sold, but delivery remains perpetually deferred. Viksit Bharat by 2047 is an admirable ambition,
safely more than 2 decades away. This budget offers no credible pathway to reach it.
Instead of narrowing the gap, it widens it. Unemployment continues to rise. Poverty hardens. Jobs remain scarce. Wages remain stagnant.
Small businesses, already gasping for relief, are smothered under layers of compliance, while informal workers, gig workers, who sustain our economy with their labor, are pushed further into invisibility and insecurity. Government promises railways, yet stations crumble. They speak of flight, yet Udan has flown away. Our pepper, once celebrated as black gold, withers under neglect. Our long coastline stretches endlessly, but is ignored when it comes to protecting it. Education is curtailed precisely when it should be expanded, while the rhetoric of world-class technology and AI grows louder. 1.5 lakh schools still function without electricity,